Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We're discussing the Dark Underbelly of Route 66. But first, we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. Route 66 is known as Americana Incarnate, freedom on the road, hitch over-the-top attractions, a ribbon of asphalt out of time and space. So what is so dark about Route 66?
Route 66 was always more than just carefree adventure. Even when the route was brand new, the myth of the freedom of the road was built around a few dark corners. Add in criminals on the run, kitsch locations that were not all family friendly, and throw in some very dark and spooky roadside stops, and you have the makings of a dark underbelly to the mother road.
We will return to Route 66, but first we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-run copy of the book, Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in that drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Every time we talk about Beard Engine Brewing Company, it makes me want to get a dark beer and a grilled peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Well, we just need to do that.
Yes, we do. And both Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company are great stops on a Route 66 tour. They're Route 66 adjacent, but definitely if you're going down the Mother Road or portions of the Mother Road, not hard to get to.
No, and worth the time to stop. So we have an idea of Route 66, and not only in America, but around the world. I think that's interesting. I think that Route 66, just off the top of my head, is probably the most romanticized stretch of highway in the world.
I believe it is. I believe it is. I really don't know of any other highway that reaches its level of iconic myth.
Right. I mean, there's certainly famous roads, don't get us wrong, but just the entire ball of wax of myth and image really does come down to Route 66. The idea of freedom on the road, I think really in a lot of ways you could say was born on Route 66.
Yeah,
and
it was. I mean, the highway was open in 1926. The conceptual birthplace, interestingly enough, of Route 66 is in the Ozarks in Springfield, Missouri.
Yes.
And so it is incredibly difficult to understate or overstate. It's very difficult to overstate the importance of the link between Missouri and Route 66 and the Ozarks and Route 66. And then how that gets translated to the rest of the world is just extraordinarily potent. And it really does it, with the 1926 opening, and then with John Steinbeck's work in particular,
Mhm.
introduced these concepts of really what we come to think of now as individualism and individualistic freedom in a modern era.
It really does. And one thing I do find interesting about Steinbeck's depiction of Route 66 in the Grapes of Wrath, and I think it's, people may be going, why are we talking about the Grapes of Wrath when we're talking about the dark underbelly of Route 66? And because when the Grapes of Wrath is discussed, particularly in school, this aspect of the book is not discussed nearly as much. Usually you get descriptions of the road as metaphor for the harshness of the times and the changing opportunities. So the differences in description of the road. However, I think it's more fundamental than that. One, not only was it a work of fiction, it was a novel, but it came out of real events. Steinbeck wrote the novel based on almost 2 years of journalistic work for the San Francisco paper, the Tribune, I believe, doing articles about the migrants on the road coming to California during the Dust Bowl. And while that really started in roughly 1935, etc., it was still kind of building on some other things that we're going to talk about that were happening on the road. But what often is not discussed about the Grapes of Wrath and Route 66 is that it has a great discussion of how the road not only is a symbol of freedom to get away from the harshness and the intractable condition of the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma to opportunity in California, although that opportunity is not pie in the sky by any means, if you read the book. It also discusses the road as basically can be a series of traps or obstacles that you have to navigate, and that things are not always as it seems. And I think a good illustration of that is it comes along in chapter 7 when they are discussing the car salesman of all things on Route 66. So you have all these migrant farmers trying to figure out how to get to California, and they're having to buy cars. And remember, in this time period, not everyone had cars. So suddenly they're trying to buy a cheap car. And so you have basically a monologue between the sales manager, basically the car lot, and other salesmen and prospective buyers, these dirt farmers, basically, who have very little money. And through the monologue, it is painted this story of how getting down the road is not as simple as it seems, and you have to understand people, you have to understand their motives, and that not everyone is as honest and forthright as maybe you are. And I think that's pretty interesting because it illustrated what was really going on. And that, and we've kind of lost a little bit of that aspect, at least consciously, when we talk about this. But I think it really is important and makes a lot of sense when you talk about the dark underbelly of Route 66 during that time period, and you're talking about Outlaws, because you have those same themes going on. And at the same time, what maybe was not conscious that early on is you had these farmers and others that were becoming the victims of the economy, victims of the banks, losing their farms and so forth. And this discussion with the car salesman in The Grapes of Wrath is wound up in that, because he's wound up with the banks, and it becomes apparent that he's manipulating the conversations and taking advantage of the plight of these farmers, backed by the banks. And that's what was really happening in real life. And so when you start talking about a lot of outlaws on the road during the 30s, it's easy for people to say, I don't understand why we are talking about people like Bonnie and Clyde or Pretty Boy Floyd, etc., because they were just bad people. And they did horrible things. But there's reasons for the stories, and there's reasons that people are drawn to them. And I think it's important to remember that in the beginning, people were horrified by these outlaws on the road, because it was a menace. You didn't know who was going to be coming down the road. Could be coming by your farm. But as the Depression went on, and people were feeling victimized by big money, by the banks, you had a beginning of the subconscious affiliation and identification with, wow, someone's sticking it to the bank. I can't, but I don't feel too bad that the bank lost that money, and the the thought process would be, it's horrible that it happened. It's horrible. And, if someone was hurt or killed, that's horrible. But the bank got what they deserved.
And first of all, it is an enduring symbol. And I think Route 66 is an enduring symbol of working class Americans.
Yes, an all-time period.
It is throughout, really from 1926 to the present, but especially during the Great Depression, and then particularly, and in certainly a more superficially vibrant way, in the 1950s and 60s.
Yes. And I'd say even really into the 1970s and 80s, when car trips were still very, very prevalent.
Yeah, and still are. I mean, it is again powerfully enduring, and I think that there's the yin and yang, because there's the light side and the dark side. The symbol of the highway landscape being essentially easy travel.
Mm-hmm.
And that has two sides to it. That could be easy travel to get to hopefully a better life, migrating in the case of the Great Depression, and not just Oklahoma, but certainly Missouri and Arkansas as well during the Great Depression, transitioning to California. And this is something that I still encounter with doing interviews, first person interviews with Ozarkers, is that they will talk about, say, a grandparent, great grandparents, families, aunts, uncles who moved to California, moved to Washington State, those types of things. For people who might not be familiar with the nomenclature of Middle America, there's Washington, as in Washington, D.C., and then there's Washington State.
Mm-hmm.
And you use that And that's one of the differentiations that I grew up with, is that if you're talking about Washington, the state, you just say Washington State. But this situation of very rural agricultural peoples moving and doing something that is very unique, in the sense that they, in various places on the West Coast, carving out and creating small bubbles of Ozarks culture on the West Coast, and then in some cases allowing that, perpetuating that for a couple of generations.
Well, and I can give you a firsthand example coming out of this, and the tensions that came with it. It was not all just well received. The migrants were not necessarily welcomed with open arms on the West Coast either. And even after the Depression, my mother, as a very young woman, moved to California and then Washington, and was living in Pasco, Washington. And there was a discussion, and I don't remember the context. She was working in a jewelry store, and someone else, a fellow that was working there who was hoping to get a promotion, said some rather derogatory things to my mother. And my mother, being my mother, stood up for herself and said, basically, in not so many words, that you're not going to talk to me that way. And his response was, "Oh, you're just a dumb Okie." And to which my mother slapped him. And the owner of the store was out that day, and the guy told her he was going to get her fired. So she comes in the next day, fully expecting to lose her job. And the owner comes in and says, "I hear there was some trouble." And she told him what happened. And she goes, I'll clean out my desk. And he goes, "You're not going anywhere. I told him you should turn the cheek and let you slap the other one." But so, there was a lot of, there was tensions. There were, I heard tales of, if, the majority, a big portion of those that went west were from Oklahoma. It was the hardest hit. And that Okie was a 4-letter word on the West Coast for a long time.
Yeah. And
so people dealt with these things, and then after a generation or two, then they were accepted as as part of California or Washington, etc. And then ironically, a couple of generations later, a lot of them came back. My mother came back after a few years, but it's funny because now there's a migration back.
Right. And that migration really started fairly early, comparatively speaking, as well. And certainly as times got better in Oklahoma and Kansas and Missouri and Arkansas, the pull of Middle America exerted itself, understandably so.
Yeah.
But with that that ease of transit, and of course we see that as giddy and exciting, and there's the migration process, of course, as with the end of the Depression, and then ultimately the victories with the Second World War, and moving into a time of comparative economic boom. That ease of transit became ease of vacation.
Yeah.
And ease of travel, essentially leisure travel, and the advent of the motor, hotel, motel. It's hard to even realize that motel is actually a portmanteau at this point, because it's just been absorbed into our language. But that very, very positive experience. But Ease of transit also means ease of transit of more than just migrant families and more than just vacationing families. Ease of transit runs across the board. And of course, that includes outlaws, that includes gangsters, that includes organized crime, that includes lots of people doing lots of things. And of course, that continues today.
It does, and it's recognized as it's basically at this point viewed as common knowledge, even by the Supreme Court of Missouri, which is interesting. But I think in most people's minds, it really starts with the 30s outlaws, and I think Bonnie and Clyde illustrate the use of the Mother Road probably as well as anybody, and especially with the trajectory of the myth that developed over time around them, and that although they were from Texas or lived in Texas at that time when it all started, and they died in Louisiana, one of the most pivotal events in their storyline, actually a couple, but the first one being Clyde Barrow's first known attempted bank robbery on his own. He had robbed a bank, it's believed, in Lawrence, Kansas previously with a couple of more experienced bank robbers. And one of them ended up in jail and one of them back in Texas. And he then, by this point, this is November of 1932, he had hooked up with Bonnie by this point, and along with Frank Hardy and Hollis Hale, decided to rob the Bank of Oronogo, Missouri, which, it is kind of amusing because, there's such a big myth, and the bank is in such a small town. At the time, a few hundred people. Today, probably maybe 4 or 5, well, maybe 6,000 or 7,000 people now, but tiny, and about 7 to 8 miles off of Route 66, so not very far at all. And they had been staying in Carthage at a motor court, and a motor court is even different than a motel. Motor court, where you still see some along Route 66, where you have the single cottages, and you would pull up and park in front of the cottage, and that was a motor court. And so there's some debate about which motor court they stayed at. Some have theorized it was Boots Motel in Carthage. There was a motor court just outside of Carthage on the east side by Kellogg Lake, on Route 66, and it's likely that's the one they were staying at. But they'd stayed there for a number of days and had basically done surveillance on a number of banks, and they decided to rob the Bank of Oronogo on November 30th. And Frank Hale and Hollis Hale and Frank Hardy had gone in first and asked the teller to fill a bag with money. And the teller, his name was Norris, he put the money on the counter and started to act like he was going to sweep the money into the bag. And what he did is he swept the money real hard, so very little of it went in the bag. And one of them said to him, you shouldn't have done that, and made some statement about you shouldn't have done that with Clyde Barrow being trigger happy or something along those lines, just as Clyde is walking in. So they managed to get away with, there's three different figures I've read. One was they got away with $110, one $126, and one $200. So they didn't get away with very much money. And it was actually the case that put them kind of put Clyde on the map and gave attention to the FBI. And they pursued the case. They charged Hardy and Hollis and Clyde Barrow with bank robbery in Jasper County, Missouri. Clyde was killed before they could serve the warrant, and Hardy and Hollis both ultimately were convicted and served time at the Missouri State Penitentiary for it.
And the mythos of the highway could not, I mean, is inextricably linked to Bonnie and Clyde.
It really is. I mean, it really is. And they made a lot of use of the highway as a way of getting away, as a way of getting from one job to another, etc. They would not have lasted as long as they did without using the highways. And that sense of being out on the road really kind of grew up. And if you read a lot of the newspaper articles of the time reporting on all this, the sense is not that, oh, these are people to be romanticized. It was, these people are on the loose and they might end up in your town was the tenor of the articles. And certainly not known by their first names only. It was always the Barrow Gang and their mall, or the Barrow Gang and the Parker woman, or something along those lines. Not romanticized at all. So there was a lot of fear surrounding this, because, and it was it was highlighted that I've seen this in a number of articles, magazine, newspaper articles of the time, that Clyde, whenever there was any sense of danger, he just started shooting. And so there was a lot of feeling of recklessness, a lot of feeling of maybe not really being in control, that kind of thing. And so I think people now, they have, either a really romanticized version of Bonnie and Clyde, or on the other hand, just this, being appalled that people talk about them at all. And what really seemed to happen after they died is their story just kind of faded away.
All the way up until 1967.
Exactly. And a good screenplay, well done, and well executed.
Very much so. Of course, for people who are not familiar, it is the film Bonnie and Clyde that was released in 1997, directed by Arthur Penn.
Yes.
And it is an iconic film. And of course, as we discussed last week, had it not been for the photos that were published that had been captured by the police in Joplin on Route 66 in the Ozarks in Missouri, there's a good chance that the film might not have been inspired, because it's those photos painted a memorable picture of Bonnie and Clyde, and put faces and personalities to otherwise names that the larger news machine was simply painting as essentially enemies of the state.
Yes. And in some respects, fairly so.
It's not unfair. Obviously, if you were the surviving family members of an individual that the Barrows gang murdered during a bank robbery or other incident, for example, the getaway from Joplin, not be a grieving widow and her small children are not going to be remembering the nuances of romanticized anti-hero status for these people.
Exactly. And I think, and I really do think that through that film, and then more recently, there have been some recent remakes, a couple of remakes in the last about 5 years. I think that the public perception of the story is of the movie, not the real events or the real people either.
I was thinking about that in doing prep for tonight's episode,
Mm-hmm.
and actually looked up the wanted poster for Clyde Barrows. At the point, he's 23 years old. When you look at the photo, 23 years old and like 125 pounds.
Yeah, and not very tall, not a big guy.
No, definitely. Well, before I get ahead of myself, what really struck me when you look at the wanted poster, straight on, he looks like a grown man. But when you look at his side profile, he looks like a teenager.
Yeah, I mean, and that's true. I mean, and he was in prison when he was, I think, 17. I mean, there. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it's, and I think this again. We always come back to the Dark Ozarks. Sometimes there are no easy answers. This is one of those cases. We see this in tonight's episode, particularly with Clyde Barrow. We will talk about this in the next episode, Route 66 Part 2, dealing with Billy Cook. There are some strong similarities here, and it's some really eye-opening and disturbing and thought-provoking commentary in terms of the justice system. And I would say, I will posit, and you're going to be a better person to make an educated opinion on this, but the fact that we have an interesting dynamic in which we have seen perhaps increased outcry over, we should, be harder on our criminals. We should do this. We should do that. Not like in the good old days when, the justice system worked. Those types of hoopla, essentially.
Yeah.
But the fact that when you look, and we'll take Clyde Barrow as an example, take and Billy Cook. The fact that we have these two outlaws who criminals who ultimately committed terrible atrocities, both very young men, both placed into the penitentiary system very, very young, ridiculously young, and then the reality that, and it's certainly when in the case of Billy Cook, and I suspect with Barrows as well, getting sent into a state penitentiary for comparatively speaking, not terrible crimes.
No, in both cases it was theft, and not bank robbery even or something like that, but more run of the mill robbery or theft, not involving violence at that point either, and both enduring, and Clyde did as well, abuse at the hands of other prisoners, etc. In fact, he cut one of his own toes off while in prison, and walked with a limp afterwards because of that, to get out of a shackle that was too tight. And so of course it can be a controversial subject, about rehabilitation versus retribution, but I think that at any given time we tend to look at our situation and the public tends to go, oh my God, it's worse than it's ever been. But if you look at it objectively, it's that's not necessarily the case. And I think today our sensibilities of wanting more retribution and harsher punishment, one is a function of we see a lot more than we used to. So anything that happens anywhere is splashed across the internet, is splashed across TV. Florida Man is a good example. How many times have you heard, Florida Man or Florida Woman stories, these outrageous, crimes or silly crimes, etc., that they're out there as clickbait. They're out there to generate ad revenue. But what happens is that people get the impression that just the level of crime has escalated. But statistically, that's not the case.
And that is incredibly powerful. I also think, and this is not to take away from sometimes the victimization, the real victimization that obviously occurs today.
Mhm.
Crime happens, and it is also not to take away from the plight of individuals who feel like they have no other choice, because that also happens today.
Right. No, it does.
And so those are very real things. I'm not saying this to diminish that, but there is something to be said for the luxury of outrage.
That's true. And what generally, and to be honest, that it tends to be selective. It tends, and I've seen this in the justice system on occasion where, people, we need to be harsher on crime. We need to be harsher on crime until it's their kid or it's their nephew or it's their cousin. And then it's, oh no, it's an othering. It's the othering of what I perceive the royal eye as not me, so and that does tend to happen. Now, and actually in researching all this last couple of weeks, looking at old newspaper articles, one thing that struck me, a lot of these articles from the early 30s, when you're looking for articles, say on Bonnie and Clyde or Pretty Boy Floyd or something, it's the number of stories you would find on a front page of a newspaper dealing with multiple outlaw gangs or horrendous murders or kidnappings. And there was one that literally on the front page, there was a big story about Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Wilbur Underhill, as well as some heiress being kidnapped and another murder, all on the front page of one paper. And so when you start looking at that, people were seeing, they were seeing a lot, but there was a lot going on proportionately. Yes. And a lot of that had to do with the economy and the job situation that, and I think important to note, with absolutely no social safety net.
Yes.
Where there's a lot more safety nets in place today for when people lose their jobs. There's unemployment benefits. There's other programs. There's private agencies that will help with housing, with these kind of things. None of those things existed in the early 30s as the Depression was going on and people were losing jobs and losing their farms, and then seeing all of this on, the front page. So, when you look at that way, the outrage you see today, I think, is more of an armchair luxury.
And coming back to, really to put a fine point on Clyde Barrows and of course on Billy Cook as well, in case anybody missed it, these were essentially teenage boys who were sent to penitentiary and then severely sexually abused.
Yes.
And
Physically and sexually abused. Yes.
we can't even really begin to imagine what that would potentially do to their headspace.
And I can tell you, as an attorney who dealt with abuse issues for 20 years plus, these kinds of issues, particularly if they're not dealt with, do tend to come out in behavior in some way later on. And so it's not surprising that you have some that ended up very violent, very reckless, and without regard for their own future safety.
And in both cases, these are individuals who, also not to put a fine point on it, were not terribly well educated.
They weren't well educated. They came from very poor backgrounds. And honestly, in both situations, after they got out of jail, they both tried to work jobs, tried to go the sort of the normal life route, and it didn't come about. And perhaps Clyde's decision to go a criminal route might have been a little more nuanced and thought out briefly than Billy's. Billy's seemed to be more of a snap decision, but I don't think either one really set out to go down that road to begin with.
It doesn't appear so. And along with, and I find this just an interesting social milieu, in the sense that talking about or being able to express these types of experiences was something that really has not become part of our society, just in terms of proper society or everyday society, until comparatively recently. And at the same time, certainly if you had been sent to prison, there was an enormous amount of stigma attached to that. I think even more so than there is now.
Yeah.
And so, without meaning to, I think we're looking at the inadvertent dark outcome of a highly retributive justice system of this time, in the sense that we're going to be super hard on crime, and in the case of both of these men, essentially creating the dynamic that would turn them into killers.
Yes. And that's not just that's not even a sociological point. Just empirical data shows that strong retribution policies don't tend to work as well as rehabilitation policies. And recidivism rates are higher. Level of violence tends to be higher among recidivists under those kind of policies. And so it's easy to say, oh, be hard on crime, but it's how you go about it. You can be hard on crime, but you have to do something with the people, or you create more of a problem in that regard, to be perfectly honest. And that's something that we still aren't real good about talking about in society outside of the circle of law enforcement and the law and punitive services. So because for most people, it's just easy to say, let's be hard on crime and we don't have to think about it. It goes away. But unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way in the real world.
And out of this process, the other thing that really struck me looking at the actual photos of Clyde Barrow and the 1967 film stills of Warren Beatty, that had Clyde survived, of course, it's a purely deconstructionist hypothetical, because had Clyde survived, we probably wouldn't have had the development of him as an anti-hero and a romanticized version and ultimately had a movie. But had he survived or somehow saw a photo of himself, quote unquote, in film, what is the likelihoods that he would have looked at that and go, who the heck is that?
Yeah.
In the sense that the Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, again, love the film, but it is a very different telling of this story.
It really is. And not only in personification with the actors involved, but everything about it, you know, they are dressed to the nines the entire time. You know, not a speck of dust on them. This was not 1930s South and Midwest, that the area that they were running through. And they were living a very hard life. I mean, even if you set aside Clyde's prior imprisonment and all those issues, and yes, their decisions got them here. We're not saying otherwise.
No.
Once you are on that juggernaut and they are on the road, and again, this is the dark side of Route 66. Once you are on that hamster wheel running, that has an effect on the mind and the thought processes.
It does.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because even up to the end, I would hypothesize they could have gotten out of it very easily.
Mm-hmm.
Up until even the day before they died, if they had gone to Mexico.
Yeah.
But it was you know, that was an out that seemed pretty obvious,
and wouldn't have been comparatively that difficult to do. The biggest takeaway, and this is going to become my enduring slogan.
Oh no.
At any day, I've had a lot of coffee today. At any juncture point, I'm just going to look at myself in the mirror and ask myself, what would Joe Shelby do? And then I'll do that. And inside joke. But
yes.
The development of Bonnie and Clyde, of course, a long process, but having them become these iconic folk heroes is something that really impacts people today, either capturing the attention, capturing the imagination, or making people angry that we're somehow glorifying killers.
Yes, and I'm going to say it bewilders me a little bit, because one, the entire notion of a folk hero is someone that would not be traditionally viewed as a hero, but appeals to the average person in some way, or that they can identify in some way. And in this sense, well, it's that sense of freedom, not because people would want to go rob banks or anything, but the idea of I could step outside my life and enjoy freedom in a way that the average person can't. or specifically during that time period, it's nice to see someone stick it to the banks,
Yeah.
that aspect of it, which again is no different than Jesse James. I mean, that's exactly the same milieu. And there are people that get upset about him being glorified, but it doesn't seem to be as many for some reason. Maybe it's the distance in time. I don't know.
I think it's a distance in time. I really do. It's far enough removed that it seems less personal.
That may be.
Ironically, most of the people that I have talked to have very strong feelings about Jesse James. And typically we're definitely in the folk hero aspect, and we're much older.
Yeah.
And which I always loved speaking, particularly to one case interview with a very elderly Ozark woman, who it was very obvious that Jesse James had been her hero since very, very early in life.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. I mean, it's just again an important facet of that iconic folk anti-hero.
Exactly. And again, and maybe I'm remembering wrong, but it seems to me that I see more people being, quote, appalled at folk heroes now than even when I was younger. It seems to be a more common knee-jerk response, and something about the time that we're in, I guess. I don't know.
It seemed like the being appalled about these folks typically was originally reserved more for the comparatively well-off women of the booster clubs of the 20th century in the old days.
Yeah.
And the same folks who might have been appalled by the earthiness of Vance Randolph or Thomas Hart Benton.
True. But
it seems to have spread.
It does, and into a sense of self-righteousness that overlooks one, that you're talking about a particular set of circumstances and a time and place that is very separate and different than where we're at now. And it just reminds me of the old cliche about, oh, don't let kids play video games, they'll be violent. Don't let kids watch cartoons because there'll be violence. Don't let, and to be honest, what it reminds me of something my mother would say, that when people were like this, or they would self-censor what they would read or so forth because they didn't want to be offended. And she would just say, it must be sad being so frail that you can't read something. And it just kind of reminds me of that if you are, it's a very one-dimensional type of thinking.
And and unfortunately it can be very contagious.
Mm-hmm.
And at risk of getting hate mail. Having raised chickens for much of my younger years, it only takes one chicken in the chicken house to freak out to get every other chicken to freak out along with them. And they don't necessarily even have to have a reason. And oftentimes,
Yeah,
to me, there's a very strong parallel, particularly in the manufactured outrage of the social media fosters on any side of an issue. And we're
very
not,
true.
it's not a partisan issue.
No.
It's any group, any side, any of this stuff. If you feel yourself if you feel yourself compelled to outrage, that is really an important point to take pause and choose introspection before you start typing things out furiously.
Yes, I mean I've never quite gotten the point of that. I guess I'm still stuck in the pre-digital age where you might hear something along these lines and you go, okay, and you go about your day. And whether you agree with it or not,
Although for, certain platforms, outrage can be wonderful for the algorithm.
That's true. That's true. Perhaps not complain too much, but it really is something that I think that if you just want to complain about people talking about folk hero in any context, I think they're missing the point.
Agreed. Agreed. And I think the biggest point is there's a very difficult, nuanced reality, and it speaks to it's a bit like looking in the mirror, which can be very uncomfortable. The fact that these are, in this case, everyday working class Americans who are suddenly committing atrocities.
Yeah. And, and again, on the mother road, and in a sense, that's not supposed to happen here, but I mean, in that time and place, it did a lot. Now, flip side, even to give it, context to this, there is an interesting note that while John Dillinger was sitting in jail at one point, and I don't remember if it was in Indiana or another time, he was reading a newspaper that had a headline about Bonnie and Clyde, and he reportedly made the statement that these yahoos are giving bank robbers a bad name.
and that that is the elevation of them as folk heroes creates a mythos that is very different than the reality. These were, a 21-year-old and a 23-year-old who were largely out of control.
They were. And so here you are with, John Dillinger, who was public enemy number one, who in comparison was regarded basically almost as a gentleman bank robber, being outraged at the way they were conducting business and killing people. Whereas John Dillinger handed out money to people on the street as he left the bank. So again, this mythos of romanticization, it is a much later phenomena.
It is. Now, jumping subjects to the opposing side of Missouri.
Yes.
And actually into the St. Louis metro, and then across the Mississippi River into Illinois to the Seven Gates of Hell. And
Collinsville.
We're on page 21 on our notes, but most of our notes are actually coming from RollersonGirlsTravel.com. And interesting, because this is basically an urban legend that seems to have spawned a life of its own.
Yeah.
And it's a series of railroad trestles in and about Collinsville. I do find it particularly fascinating because they're, if you look them up, or if you visit them, or if you, for example, if you were like me and grew up in Illinois, train trestles that look like this are a dime a dozen.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's one on the south side of Joplin, at Saginaw, actually, that is very much like this, but much longer and has its own stories. So, yeah.
complete with deeply inappropriate graffiti. And
Yes.
so it was really interesting to me because it's definitely part of urban legend. It's definitely part of clickbait. It is Route 66 adjacent. And for people who are not familiar, the seven trestles, or the essentially railroad tunnel crossings, are scattered about the Collinsville area.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was first doing initial research, I was assuming it was one large railroad bridge that, for example, had 7 arches. No,
Right.
no. It's it's a bunch of highly graffitied railroad trestles, looking much like all the railroad trestles I grew up with.
Yeah. Same.
Uh,
But
and
it's basically a scavenger hunt.
it is a scavenger hunt. At the end, you get hell.
Yeah.
The legend is that you have to drive through all of them in the right order
Mm-hmm.
and go through the last gate exactly at midnight to get a portal from hell to open up.
I mean, this is very much along the lines of the bridge legends of summoning the devil at midnight on the middle of a bridge.
It is, and really tying this, we've got essentially the railroad bridges. We're going to talk about the chain of rocks bridges, and then of course, Devil's Promenade at the end of episode 2, or part 2 of this episode. The fact that the Ozarks, this is kind of the point, framing this, that the Route 66 of the Ozarks is essentially framed by devil bridges.
Yes.
And if you do it right, then hellhounds will drag you off to hell, presumably out of your vehicle while it's still running.
Or maybe just takes the vehicle with you. I don't know. It makes it easier once you get there.
Your tour of hell is a lot more is facilitated by the fact that you have a Pontiac. So fill up beforehand. You do not want to be running out of gas quickly once you get dragged to hell.
Right.
Of course, I think very, very, and of course the process, because these are all over the place in Collinsville. So to get the timing right to go through all the railroad trestles in the correct order and pass through the last one exactly at midnight is a logistical feat in and of itself.
It's going to take more math than I want to worry about. Yeah.
Now, of course, it also brings up the idea that if you're attempting it and say, something slows you down along the way, do you suddenly become angry that it screwed up your logistics and now you don't get dragged to hell?
I guess it depends on what kind of day you've had.
That's a good point. And also, if you drive it through in reverse, starting at number 7 and then running backwards to number 1, it is supposed to cause a tear in reality.
Well, if you were able to actually do that and not have a wreck, it probably would cause a tear in reality.
True. Now, the way I read it was that they were just driving the opposite direction, but it would be if the spell requires you to do it all in reverse. That is seriously the most complex dumb supper I have ever come across.
Yes.
And as you glimpse it, looking back through the gate, you supposedly get a view into hell in your rearview mirror. Now there's logistically, or not logistically, but historically, or at least folklorically, some dark stories are associated with a various number of the trestles themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The second gate is associated with the hanging of an African American boy.
Mm-hmm.
And possibly a suicide by hanging as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's with the second gate, there's an association of seeing the apparition of bodies hanging at midnight.
But you're not going to be there at midnight if you do it right. So
Right. We assume that you do the research, the midnight research at various locations on other nights before you get dragged to hell. Preferably blog about it extensively, and then hope that there's Wi-Fi in hell so you can do at least one last blog post to let everybody know that it worked.
which this is where you really go, yeah, it has to be urban legend because this it just makes no sense.
It's a very uniquely urban legend-esque conjure.
It is. It is more ambitious than many,
It is.
which makes it kind of an interesting story, to be honest. And then gates 3 and 4, there's now we almost have to have our obligatory satanic ritual and animal sacrifices, which I think it is kind of ironic to say that we're not really sure exactly when this urban legend grew up, but during the late 70s and 80s is when this plethora of stories of satanic groups spread across the country. And there really was, it was kind of the chicken story you were telling, everyone getting frightened that Satanists were everywhere, that really were doing something that was causing something to happen. And basically, I know, I think it was the Department of Justice and some universities, they would study cases and basically never found that there really wasn't anything much organized anywhere. That there was a lot of fear mongering, and it spread like wildfire. But I'm kind of wondering if some of this came up in that time period, because the stories kind of smack of that milieu of urban legend.
It would be interesting to look into. Of course, the Trustles have been there for a long time, certainly predating the urban legends. The Trustles appear to have been built in the Collinsville area during the mining era. And essentially a crisscrossing of railroad tracks just to serve the mines. And I think that may in and of itself have been interesting with just the possibility that and I'd have to actually drive around Collinsville more to take a look, but the fact that we just may be dealing with a lot more railroad trestles in a comparatively small area than than the surrounding area.
That may be true. It's been a very long time since I spent time in Collinsville. I was in law school, so it's been a while.
Yeah. And
I wasn't really paying attention to trestles at the time.
No. Of course, I grew up with them all over the place in the Chillicothe area. So my experience with railroad trestles was, we had one very iconic trestle that was notable because on the other side it was where all the good mulberry trees were. And so if you wanted to eat mulberries, that's where you went. And it shows you what was important in my life as a kid. But I do think it's interesting. I think that sometimes the overt fascination with the occult, as well as the fact that there are aspects of of belief structures and ritual has been going on in U.S. history, or in North American history, since the beginning, that is under the radar, so to speak.
Oh,
That these elements, I think, are really, really interesting to look at and be able. And of course, what makes it difficult is parsing out fear mongering from urban legend, from clickbait, from actual experience or lived experience. And those can be all very different things.
they can, but sometimes they tend to have different feels about them too, and that's what I'm saying. Like some of this, particularly those two, that tends to smack of the satanic group fear episode of the 70s and 80s,
It definitely,
leading to urban legend.
definitely, I do not have much hesitation in placing the seven gates of hell into the urban legend category.
Yeah.
But I think it's fascinating, and I think that there's just the various, first of all, the lived experiences, but then also the anxieties of a culture, both working, sometimes one on top of the other, but sometimes separately, to feed into these larger narratives is really, really interesting, to say the least.
It is. And then I want to talk a little bit about gate sits, because it reminds me of Trestles, my experiences with them growing up. And gate sits, the story is around basically a car crash, teenagers dying in a car crash, supposedly tripping on LSD. So I take it probably in the 60s, early 70s. And it reminds me of Trestles around here. One particular, the one at Saginaw, is reputed to have hauntings, but it was boys killed in a train wreck or being hit by a train. The other big experience with Trestles, for me growing up, there were a couple of iconic ones that were known for every year receiving graffiti by the then senior class of various high schools. And so it was always, what did they put on there, and how did they do it? Because it was usually done in a spot that it would be hard to get to. Which is reminiscent, if you ever watched the 70s show, of them painting the water tower repeatedly. And so it kind of reminds me of that growing up. But so part of this really does seem to, flat out urban legend, part of it very realistic experiences of kids growing up and turning it into a bigger story, but keeping elements of what would happen is what it sounds like. So I think it's a little bit of both.
I agree. And it also, just in terms of the zeitgeist of the time, we're looking at something you mentioned before, the othering, kids doing LSD, kids doing satanic ritual, kids painting deeply inappropriate things on the side of the trestle that you can go read. And if you look it up online and blow up the pictures, you can read them there too. And it's I think that innate allure of danger and darkness, and sometimes, if that means you have to make it up in the process, so be it.
And let's face it, it's a good title. It whoever came up with the name of it, Seven Gates of Hell, it's it's catchy. It's you're going to remember it.
And moving just a little bit over and onto Route 66, of course, we've got the Chain of Rocks bridge, I should say. I was so used to saying gates of hell. I said bridges. The seven gates of hell. And the Chain of Rocks Bridge to me is a deeply, deeply fascinating location. It is a Route 66 bridge.
It is.
And it is notable for its 22-degree bend.
Yes.
In the middle of the crossing, due to both the presence of a water intake and the inability of part of the bedrock of the river to carry the weight of the bridge. And it is a walking bridge. It is preserved as a walking bridge, which makes me very happy. And it is a walking bridge that I've walked, which makes me very happy. And it is an incredible opportunity to walk from Illinois to Missouri, and then from Missouri back to Illinois, depending on where you parked. It was the scene of a double murder.
Yes.
In comparatively recent times. And that, of course, is an association with the potential hauntings of Chain of Rocks Bridge. It is a space that occupies an interesting place in me from having been there. And it is to me, it is somewhat mysterious once you're actually there. It is deeply iconic. And of course, this is the bridge into the Missouri Route 66, into Missouri's Route 66 and into the Missouri Ozarks.
Yes, I mean, it is the Route 66 bridge over the river. So
the particular true crime aspect was in 1991. Two young women were raped and murdered by a group of four men. Indirect identification. After the women were raped, they were forced off of the bridge, and the women drowned.
Yeah, I remember it happening.
Very, very horrible.
Yeah.
And and of course on the Missouri side, the Chain of Rocks amusement park was open for a long time, 1958 to 1978. Ultimately, 2 fires in 4 years, plus competition from Six Flags over Mid-America, now just Six Flags St. Louis, brought the end of the Riverside Park. And it is very interesting. The other thing, and the article references the water intakes. Of course, the water intakes preceded the bridge, but the water intakes, if you've walked the bridge, water intake does not do it justice. These look like small Romanesque palaces out in the middle of the river. They originally the first one designed in the late 19th century, so before the World's Fair, and was designed as water intake to bring water from the Mississippi River to St. Louis. And one of them is still active. They're beautiful. At least one of them has living quarters in it, a multi-story.
I didn't realize that. Yeah.
Yes. Back when they had to be manned, rather like lighthouses, so they would pay somebody to live in the water intake castle out in the middle of the river and tend the equipment and make sure that it wasn't icing over during the winter. And they are, again, there is an extraordinary. If you haven't seen them, you should go look at them, or you should look them up online. They're uniquely evocative. They're designed to look much older than they are, and they're old now. And They look like something out of to me out of a Romanian fairy tale.
That's enough to, that someone should go just to see that.
My the first one was built in 1894, and the second one was built in 1915. And it's hard to they're hard to explain. I mean, unless you actually go look at them. But they're sitting out there, and you can get a great view of them from walking the bridge. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to walk the bridge. And the first half, from Illinois side, I was parked on the Illinois side and walked over to Missouri. A couple of things. The first, the Mississippi River has always been incredibly important threshold space for me since I was born. I grew up traversing the Mississippi River minimum of a couple of times a month, and it always held an extraordinary space in my psyche as a result of it. But it was not until the Chain of Rocks Bridge that I had the opportunity to walk across the Mississippi. I had driven across the Mississippi or ridden across the Mississippi more times than I care to count. But to walk across the river on the bridge, for me anyway, was an exceptionally powerful experience. Because first of all, you get a real scope of just how truly massive this river is.
Yeah.
It's one thing to look at it at 45, 50 miles an hour, or if you're on an interstate bridge at 65 miles an hour, or sometimes more. But to walk across it was an almost spiritual experience for me.
That makes sense.
The other is that the first half of the bridge from the Illinois side up into about the bend felt a unique form of pressure that I have come to associate with paranormal spaces.
Interesting.
A very strong sense of pressure, particularly forward pressure, almost the sense of being buffeted by a heavy wind, but not the wind.
Yeah, I've encountered that.
And not as intense as my experience on the bridge on the Missouri River at Boonville.
Yeah.
But still a sense, just imagine that you are walking into a strong buffeting headwind. But it's not the wind that appears, that's actually what feels like it's pushing you back. And
that in part could be amplified because of everything going on in that space, the river moving, the water intakes, everything as amplifying things. And then certainly, you have the women who died there, and I'm sure there's been others, and likely even suicides off the bridge over time.
There have been, I believe, a number of them. Some have certainly been, are more well documented than others.
Yeah,
and it's an intense space. It's a threshold space. I think interesting because it's a threshold into an entire land. I mean, this is the path for original Route 66 travelers. This was the bridge into Missouri.
Yeah. Well, and throughout a lot of our history, just getting past the Mississippi was a significant milestone, whether it was for the nation, for a business, or an individual. It marked a huge obstacle, opportunity, and remaking oneself in the West.
It was. And originally, you think of how long it was that the Mississippi River was essentially the border of the nation.
Mhm.
And now tens of thousands of people drive across the Mississippi River every day,
Yeah.
oftentimes without thinking about it. It's a phenomenal. It's humbling, really, and certainly you look at the water intake. It's so odd to call them water intakes. They're little Romanesque palaces in the deep, and in this incredibly iconic bridge that, comparatively speaking, in the broader scope of time and space, was just a blink of an eye ago that it would have been impossible to traverse. And now we just go, yeah, we just cross these places. No big deal. But it is a big deal.
It really is. And it's no wonder that there's something there lingering.
No. And again, there folklorically, there are constantly conflicting reports about spirit interacting with water. In some cases, spirit following water. In some cases, the lore said spirit can't cross water, so on and so forth. But what is consistent in terms of paranormal research and in terms of folklore is that spirit is significant in relationship to water.
Yes. And I do find in actual research that particularly moving water often has attendant haunting very close to it.
Mm-hmm. And I will also say that the wetlands, the heavily forested wetlands on the Illinois side, have a vibe. Definitely have a space. Recommend you actually go out there to see for yourself. And it's a nice, open, beautifully preserved space, but I think there's things in the dark.
I think that's very likely. And things in the dark, and you're talking about the Illinois side, often it's funny, we were talking beforehand that often when people are talking about Route 66 locations, they actually will associate Alton with it, although Alton is 30 miles north, something like that.
Not that far.
20, 30.
It's really not that. I have to look it up, but I've driven it. It doesn't take you very long unless there's rush hour. But it's adjacent. It's Route 66 adjacent. And I love the fact that Alton does get included in the process. It would be a bit of a misnomer to say that it's on Route 66, but it's definitely adjacent. And Alton holds a very special place in my heart in terms of history and paranormal experience. And the histories and I would say, counter pressures, both socioculturally, paranormal, etc., of the pressures between Alton and St. Louis have existed really since the development of the cities.
Very true. In our theme of Route 66 and just the road as a metaphor for these topics, and the role that crime and outlaws have played, Alton fits in there very well.
It does. For just a little bit of context, Alton was essentially a Federalist an abolitionist outpost
hmm
standing in opposition to pro-slavery South.
Right. And although, I mean, even though it had those leanings, they certainly, abolitionists were not immune in Alton.
I was going to
Reverend
say there's
Lovejoy is
power,
a good example of that.
powerful contradictions within that. In the case of a famed abolitionist printer being lynched or hanged in relationship to his pro-abolitionist stance in direct proximity to a hostile pro-slavery South. But part of this is on both sides of the river. Of course, Missouri has its own unique narrative within the Civil War era in terms of being both North and South simultaneously and caught in the midst of that. We're also, as close as Collinsville is considered to be a northern point of Little Egypt, the southern triangle of Illinois that was, in some cases, as much, if not more, southern than other portions of the South.
That is true. That is true. So, and they are pretty close together there. So
They're right there. And but certainly when you look at the history of Alton, you look at the its development was largely envisioned as a Federalist city. It's reflected in the architecture. It's reflected in aspects of things from the fact that a significant Confederate prisoner of war camp and prison was maintained there, which is considered to be contributive to the hauntings, and the fact that Lincoln was in the town at least once, not eating pie, but should have been. And
yeah, I'm still I still like the fact that walked across the threshold that Lincoln did. So
yes, and then the fact that the General Lyon, who was later killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, when he moved the Union munitions from St. Louis to keep them out of the hands of Missourians who were potentially threatening to side with the Confederacy, potentially rumored to be, allegations thereof. It gets fuzzy, sort of.
yeah, but pretty well founded once they marched south.
It's but he moved them to Alton.
Yeah.
With the understanding that that the Union garrison and essentially fortressing of the city as a Union Alton really became in that sense a Union stronghold during the war.
Yeah.
And Alton later was vying with St. Louis as to which city was going to become the major riverboat port.
That is true. And then as time went on and we get into the 20th century, there was a presence of gangsters and organized crime that is reminiscent of these other events along Route 66 in the Ozarks.
It is, and I think that's very important. A lot of organized crime well into the modern era. Very, very evocative. Some of it directly associated with Mineral Springs Hotel.
Yes. Yes.
Which we've investigated. Highly recommend it. Don't get punched in the nose again.
I guess we have to go back to see if it happens again.
Right, exactly. It's a process, and it's one of the things. Of course, what really was reminiscent to me was of this was that the Mineral Springs Hotel was definitely a center point of whatever was going on since it was built, because it was so iconic in town. And having experienced, certainly gotten the tour, experienced the stories, etc. A couple of points that really stand out to me was first of all with the ballroom, the sort of 1960s era ballroom that's still there. The rumors in terms of illicit just north of St. Louis brothels in the basement plural. A lot of syndicated crime associated that was there, really facilitated by the industry and the network of industry, the railroad, the crossroads, the whole bit. I remember standing in that ballroom. It was very late at night. Most of the lights were out except for just sort of, utility light areas.
Yeah.
And looking out and just getting the sense of the river. And it really is, and I use this in the most conjuration sense that I can possibly muster, a crossroads.
Oh, I think so, and certainly the sulfur well in the basement is evocative of that.
Yeah,
Especially if you might continue the conversation at Gates of Hell.
I was going to say the logistical complexities of the railroad trestles is completely beside the point. Just drive to Alton and go to the sulfur pit. It's much easier to access.
With the deadpan, don't walk out on it. You look at it and go, "Who would?"
Yeah. So to paint a picture for you people, if you have not been to the Mineral Springs Hotel, on the Alton is undeniably built on the side of a hill, and so the river bluff is it slopes steeply down to the Mississippi River, and the Mineral Springs Hotel, if you are on the primary main street that is running north-south, parallel with the Mississippi River, it's up higher on the bluff. Mineral Springs Hotel is like 2 stories tall, but then it's like 16 on the other side. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. And
this keeps going,
it keeps going. And so you have this a beautiful building, but you have with a troubled past and troubled history, and you just have layers of basement that you get into. And so the palatial basement that was filled with sulfur water, let that sink in for a moment. With the rumor of a demon that lurks around in the underbasement. So there's that one. And lots of interesting spaces right there. And then you go to another portion of the building and then work your way down the stairwells to the real basement. Now, because of the declination of the hill, on the river side, the real basement, if you did walk out, you'd walk out at street level next to the railroad track. So that is a reality of it. But you get down there and it is cavernous. It is, and the massive cement underpinnings of what's holding the rest of the building up. You're wandering around in it, a massive space. And then in the back, and of course, as you make your way into some of the lower recesses of the building, you're like, I think I smell sulfur. And anybody who watches Looney Tunes knows that's indicative of something. And then you get down there, and toward the back is a giant pit, and the pit is full of trash that is slowly sinking. And then you are told you can stand on the edges, but don't walk in the middle of the trash because we don't know how deep the pit is. No, I am not walking into the middle of that. You really could not drag me into the middle of that without a lot of effort. But of course, this was the origin of the hotel. And, considering the boosteristic hubris, that's my phrase for the night, the boosteristic hubris of America at the turn of the 20th century. If you were somebody like me and you discovered a stinking sulfur well on a property, my innate reaction would be, let's just cover it up and forget that we found it. Don't do anything else. That seems like a really horrible idea. But no, we're going to capitalize on it as much as humanly possible and build a hotel and pump the sulfur water, the warm sulfur water, mind you, out and advertise it as healing water. So come soak in the warm sulfur water that leaked out of the earth, and stay in the hotel that is directly built over the pit into hell. It's convenient.
Well, I guess in all fairness, they did that before the advent of penicillin. And at that point, sulfur was used to combat bacterial infections.
Absolutely. And of course, the other side of this is that we have a long history of, in positive ways and in somewhat charlatanistic ways, the profiteering on essentially healing waters.
Yes.
And very common in the 19th century and in the early 20th century.
Yes.
So I'm not entirely. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then you throw in the fact that as we get into the 1920s, that basically the mob starts moving into the hotel.
Yes. And I will say, I keep referring to it as the mouth of hell, very tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
At the same time, I am not walking out on that pit under any circumstances.
No.
I don't know how deep it is. You don't do that. But I find it interesting that from the historical record that we seem to have, that the individuals who decided to capitalize on the pit of sulfur water of unknown origin or depth did not appear to have any second thoughts about it. And certainly my late 20th century, yes, I watched Poltergeist headspace would.
Yeah. It's all context.
It is. It is a very haunted location.
It is. It definitely is. I will attest to that.
Yes. And so is McPike Mansion, which is up on the hill. I highly recommend visiting McPike. I know we've talked about it in depth in other episodes, but I just want to plug the mansion. Incredibly gorgeous, still under refurbishment. And anything that you can do to visit, go on a tour, go on a Halloween time tour, whatever, does go to help the mansion. And beautiful location, and a very different, from my experience of having been in both spaces, two very different types of hauntings.
I that's fair from everything I've heard. I haven't been in Pike, but everything I've heard, I would characterize it different.
And but of course, Alton is definitely known for its hauntings at this point in a positive way.
Yes. And I can't wait to go back.
I do too. Also a pretty significant underground railroad crossing as well.
That's true. Very, very true. Which again, just that idea of movement.
Yes. And one of the hauntings that was relayed to us, not part of our investigation, but that was relayed to us, seems to be with the hotel, seems to be associated with the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
So lots and lots of parks. And of course, then you cross the bridge into St. Louis. Folks do not traditionally think of St. Louis as part of the Ozarks, but about a half of the metro is geologically within the Ozarks mountain
Yes.
plateau.
And certainly either directly or adjacent to Route 66. So
Oh, very much so. And then of course there's frozen custard and waffle cone. So
shout out to Ted Dryers.
it is so good. It is so good. Now, I mean, we could do, and I think we will at some point, and have to a degree, entire episodes on St. Louis. The hauntings at the Limp Mansion certainly stand out, and potentially at the Day Manil Mansion right next door. And there's a lot. What jumps out for you with the Route 66 St. Louis space?
Well, to me, always just driving through, there's just that sense of I've always felt that almost that is a threshold in itself. And it's hard for me to pick because there's several, but the entire riverfront area to me has always felt very haunted. We don't talk about it a whole lot in that respect, but that entire area has always just felt like I'm being watched. And I can't really explain any particular reason. Now, there were Indian mounds in the vicinity of actually even where the arch is. So I kind of wondered if that's part of what I feel there. But I mean, Webster Groves has always had a feel for me that is very ominous. Not in a bad sense, but perhaps solemn is a better word. And I do know that there was the orphanage there that burned down, and I don't know if that's it but that story's always called to me. And that would be the St. Louis Protestant Orphans Asylum. And let's see, I forget when the fire was, but that entire area right through there has always drawn my attention.
Yeah.
It's an old area too.
And a number of different spaces. One area that to me is really, really interesting, it's deeply folkloric, is Lake Crevecoeur.
Yes.
I find it interesting, the largest naturally occurring lake in Missouri.
Yeah.
Interesting distinction, because our impoundments have created massive lakes that dwarf Lake Crevecoeur. However, when you actually go visit Lake Crevecoeur, you are struck by its immensity. And this is very much a post 20th century perspective, but you look at it and you go, this is a giant lake for not having been built.
That's true. We're so used, at least in this part of the country, we're so used to lakes being built.
Yes.
Other parts of the country, they might not feel that way, like say the Great Lakes, but that is true. And since I was just being drawn in and almost not wanting to leave.
Yes, it is. It has a very unique allure to it would be the best way. It's difficult to explain. We've been there,
Hmm.
and to me it was very contradictory to the activity going on around it. Of course, it's a very popular recreational space.
Right.
In large portions of the area leading up to the lake, there are beautiful, very well maintained walking trails. There are public restrooms. There's lots of parking. It's not in the certainly large sections of it. The section that we were at is not shrouded in forest or anything. It's not a mysterious, dark, enshrouded space by any stretch of the imagination.
It's a
Very,
comfortable park like setting.
very, very comfortable, but also very open, very Midwestern in it, in its aesthetic. And the day that we were there on the weekend. It was a beautiful early spring afternoon. Lots of people.
Yeah, there were a lot of people there.
Lots of people everywhere. It's just the idea of being utilized as imagine a large suburban park in the Midwest with a lot of people.
Just named Broken Heart.
Yeah. Yeah. But so there was all of that sort of bustle, all of that sort of cacophony of superficial energy.
Hmm. And sound and movement.
Mm-hmm. But as I do what I mean, and we've talked about this before, but my best way in terms of judging a paranormal space is to put myself into the space as a journalist and just absorb, and then give myself like a week, primarily for my more rational, intellectual mind and my intellectual analysis, to the left side of my brain, essentially to wear down and kind of forget, and let my intuitional side say, what does my intuitional side sense from the space? And the intuitional sense that I keep coming back, and I remember the afternoon extremely well, but that overarching sense that all of that park cacophony being very superficial,
Hmm.
and then beyond that an intuitional sense of picking up just extreme depth and a watchfulness from the water, which I find really interesting.
Well, but it makes sense when you look at the lore coming out of there that goes back pre-settler, goes back to the Native Americans and actually multiple stories, all involving tragedy, one way or another. You have your traditional Indian princess story. You have another, which basically is a battle between warriors involving a maiden as well, but a little bit more akin to who's going to dominate the area, which tribe. And one of the father really just sacrificing the daughter. And for me, it's kind of interesting, because for me, the intuitional side is what I process first.
Yes.
And then I let that recede, and the rational side analyze this.
Yeah.
But standing in that space, my intuition was it felt right that something like that may have happened there. Whereas in a lot of those types of stories, it doesn't have that same genuine feel and it's more that feel of it's a story that's been brought in from somewhere else and been attached to a particular landmark, even though there's not a real story behind it. There, I felt like it was very believable that something like that happened.
There is something about the water and the hill behind it. And
Mhm.
I, for one, just me personally, would be unbelievably uneasy if I was actually out on the lake.
Yeah, I did not have the sense that I really wanted to be out on the water, and there's no real rational reason for that.
Yeah. And lots of
But
people were out on the water.
mhm.
I did find it interesting that they have a no swimming policy.
Yeah, I don't, and I'm not sure why. I'm not sure.
I mean, interestingly enough, it is a deep, naturally occurring lake.
Yeah, it's deeper than it looks.
Mhm.
So, and there may be undercurrents. I'm not sure what all the reasons for that is, but
Yeah.
um, I had no compulsion to go swimming. I have to say that.
No, no, but it is very beautiful. It's a very special place. It's a very unique place, really, right in the midst of the St. Louis metro.
Yeah. Actually, in law school, I lived not too far from there. So,
Interesting. Yeah, it's a neat space. And speaking of neat and interesting spaces in the St. Louis metro, our concluding space for tonight's episode is the urban legend internet clickbait location, Zombie Road.
yes. And there are some that will swear by the stories, but it really is not. It's not what it's come to be known as in the internet age. I will say that.
Well, it doesn't. There is certainly the possibility of paranormal activity there. Oh, we do not have any zombies.
No, and it's again a good exercise in urban legend of how the name came about and the stories behind it. One in particular, the zombie aspect of it goes to, and it's the classic high school, college urban legend of a secluded space
Mhm.
and zombies of some sort and a psychiatric hospital. That supposedly we have an escaped patient, mental patient out there, killing people or at least terrorizing people who are out there for no real reason at that point, because we are talking about an area off of a railroad spur that is not a functioning road at this point. So it's to be out there, you are out there looking for something.
Yes.
It's a
Yeah,
chicken and the egg problem here. So,
it is. It is. And I'm gonna simultaneously admit to paranormal activity, which is no big surprise, and at the same time potentially deflate some of the mystique. What might be disconcerting to people is that an extraordinarily high number of locations experience paranormal activity.
true.
And so going I again there I think kind of coming back to a theme that we discussed at the beginning, the potential of the human mind to think of certain bad things as happening elsewhere and other.
Right.
The bad people committing bad crimes, not in my family, not in my space, not in my town. Well,
Someone
probably.
else's backyard.
Yeah, someone else's backyard, far, far away. And then deciding how you feel about that. Do you look down your nose at them? Do you feel good about yourself? Do you feel pity? Do you feel remorse? Do you feel empathy? The one thing that I think we're consistently trying not to do is feel a connection,
Right.
a connection with ourselves. And one of the first things I think in terms of a healthy, or I would say a balanced interaction with the real world, and also a balanced interaction with the paranormal, is understanding that that other over there someplace else is our construct, not realities.
Very true. Very true. It think of it as a coping mechanism.
Yes. And I'm going to posit that places like Zombie Road, the Albino Farm, fill in the blank, become psychic focusing points
Mm-hmm.
for the other. And part of the reason that on the internet it becomes a focusing point, the seven gates of hell being another one, the sense that there's these terrible places that awful things happen, but it's over here. In the case of the seven gates of hell, it's really difficult to conjure the process. In the case of Zombie Road, it's very much out of the way. In the case of the Springfield Albino Farm, quote unquote, which never existed, you're relying upon hearsay from somebody else to tell you where it is. It's difficult to find, so on and so forth.
Right.
And then sometimes you get an interesting overlap of reality mimicking the legend, in the sense that, for example, Spooklight Road, if you don't know where it's at, you're going to have a hard time finding it. Those types of things.
That's true, because it's, there is no street sign that says that. And people, it's kind of, if you haven't been there, it's hard. You have to ask someone how to get there. So,
And
but,
then go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, with these highly focused points, the interesting thing is that we create the construct in our mind that we've othered this space.
Mm-hmm.
And then we go there looking for paranormal activity, on a dare to scare ourselves, so on and so forth. Then I would put it at about 50-50, thereabouts. 50% chance that you go out there with a heightened readiness to be freaked out. It's in the dark, for example. You might not be used to this kind of space in the dark. You hear coyotes in the distance. You hear a possum rustling around in the leaves. You see, a deer's reflective eyes in the shadows. I literally have been in the timber at dusk when a squirrel woke up and stretched inappropriately from a nest about 90 feet in the air and fell out.
Mm-hmm.
And if you didn't know, you would be like, what the hell is that? And it's all very, very reasonable and rational. And there's nothing creepy about it. But if you have a heightened readiness to other that space for a variety of social anxieties, your brain will fill in the blanks.
I mean, and that's true. And I think that brings up a point that if there's not paranormal activity there, that you may be bringing paranormal activity into the space through basically a thought form.
Yes.
By focusing your own anxiety energy that you have built up around this space, which is a real psychological condition that can happen. And there's been various experiments with it that indicate that we can manifest energy outside our body.
Yes.
Now, the flip side to that is some people are going to say, no, that there were, I know I've heard these stories about the escaped mental patient. Well, there were no mental hospitals anywhere close to this area ever. Now the flip side is, if there is some paranormal activity and you're looking at, is there something that happened there that may have caused it? There was an incident in the 1870s where a train was, from St. Louis had run out on the track that's no longer running, and is no longer, parts of it are no longer there, and had stopped. And I don't recall the reason it had stopped, but another train came through and hit it, and there were deaths, including most prominently the wife of a St. Louis judge. And so the story grew up that her ghost was seen out there, well before the age of the idea that it was somehow zombies or mental patients. So maybe part of column A, part of column B, maybe there is some activity from, say, the train wreck or something that happened out there. And maybe, but I think a lot of what happens there are people bringing energy into that space, so anticipating something that they, in essence, create paranormal activity.
And the other side, I think, is an important potential dynamic, is because of the fact that there are so many places that actually do have paranormal activity. We've talked about a recent episode, seemingly random fast food restaurants, modern apartment buildings, lots and lots of various people's homes. I've had paranormal experiences that meandered through this house. It was built in 2007, and then left. And the interesting thing is that we usually don't realize it because we're not paying attention. Now we have a space that has this focused point, and people are going out there being hyper vigilant. They may actually be seeing or experiencing something that if they were paying that kind of attention, for example, in their own bathroom, they might be experiencing it there too. And so, because again, paranormal activity is a lot more common than people realize, but usually we miss it because we're not paying attention to it.
Right. Or we're just filtering out, as I say, our brain filters out about 90% of the information that it receives. And so you add in being distracted or sleepy or hungry or listening to the TV in the other room, you can miss a lot of things. And I think that is a good point that, for instance, people will say or expect that activity happens at night. Well, more reports actually happen during the day. Of course, statistically, more people are awake, more people are up and around. So statistically, that makes sense, although it's different than the expectation. And so our built-in expectation is almost a variable in that.
Yes. It is. And then in some cases, and it is interesting. Now we do associate, this might be a good, interesting discussion upon which to close, but we do, so like the trite pop culture insinuation is that hauntings really pick up at night. And of course, with our paranormal investigations show, that is so often not the case. You pick up EVPs and in various evidence, it really at any time. And one of the more common sense realities is that Nighttime, it's a lot quieter. And so it's easier to be hyper aware during that time. So that's certainly an aspect. But and I'm not saying that that's not. I'm gonna go back to our YouTube video, and we'll talk more about this on the next episode. But a location at Six Flags that I found interesting in the day, but it showed up like a beacon after nightfall.
I'm almost like, a being focused under a microscope or something. Yeah.
In the sense, I think the closest example I would be is sort of an energetic space acting like it was under black light.
Okay. I mean,
in the sense that how how black light works, obviously, but you could be looking at an image and be like, oh, that's really interesting in the broad daylight, but then let it get dark and put a black light on it and it glows.
Yeah.
And this particular space at Six Flags, that's how I tend to remember it, in the sense that when I was there, the broad daylight, it's like, interesting. But then after nightfall, there was an incredible pull that really felt like it had intensified after the sun went down.
And that makes sense to me, and actually even more literally makes sense with the analogy with black light, because in investigation, UV light often is a better medium for illumination than IR, although IR is more common.
Yes, agreed.
So,
agreed. Yeah, and it's very interesting. It really is, and I'll find those photos. We can publish them on the social.
Okay,
so
that sounds good. So yeah, so you might look for those as well, and so that might be a good spot to end on tonight. We want to remind everyone not to forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
And on the next episode, we are going to be discussing the Dark Underbelly of Route 66 Part 2. We have a lot left to cover throughout the state of Missouri and into Oklahoma. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcast, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.